Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation on the Battle of Midway, the turning point in the war in the Pacific. We extend a warm welcome to our fellow veterans who are viewing this presentation from the Edith Norse Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in nearby Bedford, Massachusetts. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Gresh Lattimore. Gresh Lattimore became interested in naval service as a graduate student at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Inspired by some naval officer classmates, he enrolled in officer candidate school at Newport, Rhode Island, and received his commission in 1966. He served 2 tours of combat duty aboard the USS Coral Sea off the coast of Vietnam. He served another tour as a faculty member at West Point. After active service, Gresh returned to the Fletcher School to earn a PhD. He joined the Naval Reserve as an intelligence officer, retiring in 1990 aboard the USS Constitution after 23 years of service at the rank of captain. One of the joys of his life is his work as president of the Advocates for Tufts ROTC, an alumni support group for Tufts University's ROTC students. He's a member of the Lexington Veterans Committee, the Veterans Executive Committee. And after retiring from a career in banking, Gresh pursued his lifelong interest in military history. Please welcome Gresh Lattimore.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, once Linda moves away from the screen, I'm wearing my Coral Sea ball cap. I'm a carrier sailor, so this whole topic of the Battle of Midway is very meaningful to me because I've served aboard an aircraft carrier during the Vietnam War, and I actually spent 2 tours where our air wing were bombing the North Vietnamese. So we didn't have to fight like in World War II with the problems of Japanese kamikazes or anything like that. But nonetheless, aircraft carriers are magnificent warships, and here's an early indication of how important they would be. So let's move on to the Battle of Midway, June of 1942. This is a battle, you might even consider it somewhat like Trafalgar, where the British defeat the French and Spanish combined fleets and preclude Napoleon from mounting an invasion against Great Britain. Here at the Battle of Midway, there is also a victory for American arms. We preclude the Japanese getting any closer to us than they already are in the faraway Pacific. And we also halt their aggressive push into the rest of the Pacific area. Here's an indication of the first 6 months after the Pearl Harbor sneak attack. The Japanese ran wild in the Pacific. And this slide shows you how far Japanese armies and navies went. You can see over there at Japan, they went over into China. They came down into Indochina, which is Vietnam in that area. They got to the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. So what they had hoped for is that at Pearl Harbor, they would have taken our carriers out. But that didn't happen. Our carriers were at sea when the raid was made on December 7th. And so Yamamoto, whom we'll see a photo of shortly, decided that the only way to bring the US carriers to battle, and he believed that would mean defeat, was to go to Midway, invade Midway, hold those two little tiny islands 1,300 miles west of Hawaii, and force us, now without carriers and having been defeated, to the negotiating table. But this didn't happen. So as you can see here, during those 6 months, the Kido Butai is really the Japanese for mobile force. And the Kido Butai included 6 fleet carriers. Now, these are not pictures of the carriers. These are pictures of the ships those carriers sunk from December to June of 1942. So they were having quite a rampage in that area. And during that time, of course, they were getting all sorts of experience, and they also built up a high degree of arrogance because they were so successful everywhere. Here are the command admirals for the Japanese fleet. Yamamoto on the left is in overall command of the Navy in Japan. And it was because of his planning that this Midway attack idea came to fruition. Now, Yamamoto had served as a military attaché in America in the 20s. He became a great poker player. He toured the nation and was very cognizant of the industrial power that the United States possessed. And he was very frank in saying to his Japanese comrades and colleagues that if you give me 6 months, I can run wild in the Pacific. But then once the Americans bring their industrial strength to bear, we'll have had to do what we had to do by then, or it just wouldn't work. Now, Admiral Nogumo was also an attaché to America in the 20s, and he was a very highly respected admiral because his Kido Butai fleet carriers had done such great things in those first 6 months. So he is going to be in charge of the attack force. Now, the Japanese attack plan was pretty sophisticated, very complicated. Over 300 ships, 100,000 sailors. We'll see a critique of this at the end of this presentation, but the mobile force of those 4 carriers will not only be responsible for attacking the US carriers, but it will be responsible for destroying the Midway military installations. So you have a dual responsibility of these carriers, which will complicate things, as we'll see. 16 attack submarines were, of course, to be in front of the whole fleet that was sent toward Midway. They turned out not to be very helpful or to mean much to the force. There were 5,000 troops that were part of an invasion force that would occupy the Midway Islands. And also, so you have the carriers coming in, you've got a force that will bring in invasion troops, and then you have an Aleutian Island to the north which will be responsible for having a presence in our Aleutian Islands. This is a kind of complicated schematic, but if you look in the middle, there's Nogumo with his attack force. Below is another admiral, Admiral Kondo, with his invasion force. And then you have Hosokawa there with the northern force, which was going to go after the Aleutians. In a more simplistic way, you can see how these Japanese forces were to converge upon Midway. Midway, I'm sorry, I have a tiny slide later on, but I should have had a bigger one. Midway is just two little islands, and one is essentially a runway island, and the other is the installation island. Very small, 5,000 troops are going to be pretty crowded there. But nonetheless, this is what Yamamoto wishes to do. In his carrier force of the Kido Butai are 4 of the top Japanese fleet carriers. Akagi, down in the lower right, is the flagship. All of these carriers have aboard them torpedo planes, fighter planes, and also dive bomber planes. And so the idea of carrier operations at this point in time in early World War II was for each carrier to launch its torpedo planes and dive bombers, and they are then to make coordinated attacks, both of them at the same time. The bombers coming in from high, the torpedo bombers coming in low, and of course you would hope that they'd be led by fighter aircraft to protect them. But these coordinated attacks would ideally take place so that it would be very difficult for each carrier to defend itself. Now, here are the admirals of our fleet, the US fleet. After Pearl Harbor had been attacked, its commander, Pacific Fleet, was replaced by Chester Nimitz. Chester Nimitz is a submariner by experience in the Navy, and he, over the years, had become very esteemed because he was, although a very low-key figure, he was very interested in giving everybody their say, and then he would make the final decision. So Chester Nimitz is head of the Pacific Fleet, and he is senior to both Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher. Now, Fletcher, we'll see shortly, has already had carrier experience against the Japanese at the Battle of the Coral Sea, which happened before Midway, and we'll speak about that in a few moments. He, in time, is sort of overshadowed by Ray Spruance, the commander of the other task force sent out by Nimitz to essentially ambush the Japanese fleet. But before we get into the actual day of the battle, or days of the battle, let me point out that between December of 41 and June of 42, we weren't just sitting back in the Pacific and doing nothing. Maybe some of you are cognizant or know about the Doolittle Raid. This took place in April of 42, and it was the brainchild of General Doolittle, Air General Doolittle, to take a bunch of B-17s and send them over Tokyo, drop their bombs, and then crash land in China and be picked up by the nationalist Chinese. It worked. It very deeply embarrassed the Japanese. But it's an indication that we were very innovative in our fight. The Battle of the Coral Sea was significant because that happens the month before Midway. And again, our carriers had been raiding the various points closest to us, like on Lake Island and so forth, in that part of the South Pacific. And at the Coral Sea, this was the first battle where the two aircraft carriers never saw each other, just their planes attacked each other. And we were able to sink one of their small carriers, as well as disable one of their fleet carriers, and another fleet carrier was taken out of action because it just didn't have enough of its own air wing to be helpful. So you have the Navy being very much engaged in going after the Japanese Navy, but there hadn't been a major battle to this point beyond Coral Sea. The other important thing that's happening during this time is our Navy our code breakers, led by Lieutenant Commander Joe Rochefort, finally broke the naval code of the Japanese fleet. And what he was able to ascertain is that they were planning some sort of a big fleet action against Midway. And although he was assigned in Hawaii, that's where he was actually part of a Washington, D.C. chain of command. And they initially didn't believe him. So what he had to do is signal the folks on Midway, not through the regular channels so that the Japanese might know, but he wanted them to send out a message saying our water purification process is down and we need some assistance. And so they sent that out in their regular code. And by Jove, the Japanese had broken our code to the extent where they sent out a message to their fleet that at Midway, the fleet, there was a problem with the water there. And that confirmed that the MI, the Joe Rochefort, had discovered that the series of messages about that meant that they were targeted to Midway. And so Washington then assented to Joe Rochefort's proving that he went ahead and actually had broken the Japanese code. So what this meant is we knew about this invasion, but the Japanese did not know that we knew. And so Nimitz, back here, I'll show you Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz there on the left put together an ambush plan. And what he would do is end up sending his three carriers northwest of Midway, and he would be able to then ambush the carrier attack force, which was coming from Japan at that point. I can show you another schematic to give you a better idea. Whoops. I'm getting too far ahead. Sorry. But anyway, Nimitz is going to ambush the Japanese fleet. I have Saratoga there, but Saratoga was not available for this particular battle, so she is not there. So we do not have an overwhelming carrier force to begin with, but nonetheless, our three carriers there, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, will then fight the Japanese. Let me go back and talk about just quickly. There you go. Let's talk about carrier operations. Many of you will know this particular plane. It's the Zero. And the Zero was renowned, especially early in the Pacific carrier wars, for its agility to attack and and take down other planes. So the big downfall of the Zero was that it had little or no armament, and which made it vulnerable if you hit it. And also, the armament that it carried didn't have many rounds of ammunition. For instance, the most important round of ammunition, they only had 60 rounds. So what they would have to continuously do is go back to their carrier, land on the carrier, and be rearmed, and then be launched again. So, but nonetheless, the Zero was greatly feared early in the war. We had, for our own, we had the comparable Wildcat fighter, and this was a much heavier aircraft. Our tanks sealed, our gas tanks sealed when a bullet hit them from somebody else, and so they were very effective. Now, each carrier, as I said before, carried dive bombers and torpedo planes. Ours were the Dauntless, which were very effective, and we'll see that shortly, and the Devastator, which was a torpedo bomber. So let's get into the actual Midway battle. I've taken it a day early because our scouts, and we had about 30 scout planes out in the Pacific searching for the Japanese fleet, which we knew was coming. And at 9:04 on June 3rd, they found it. Now, this was the invasion fleet. And so the Japanese were not too disturbed because they felt, okay, these are planes from Midway that are finding us. And so, yes, our element of total surprise is gone, but we're still going to be able to get to the American fleet in due course. We attacked them from Midway later that afternoon, but to no avail. Early on, our attacks against Japanese forces were not effective. Now, I've put the day of June 4th, and that's the most important day, into 3 phases, because we're going to have an initial phase where we have the launch of the attack by the Japanese on the Midway Islands. And then you see that at 4:30. At 5:30, we find where the Japanese carriers are. And so we're going to start maneuvering our carriers so that we can attack the Japanese carriers. Now, the Japanese attack on Midway itself comprised of 72 planes. I've seen other numbers, but it was a big attack. Yet you remember that Nimitz had fully fortified Midway. So they lost a lot of planes and didn't do enough damage. So their air commander called back to Akagi and said to Nogumo, we've got to have a second attack to really damage the runways so that they can't use it anymore. So during this time, Midway and not only had armed itself on the island itself, but it also had a hodgepodge bunch of planes which were sent against the carriers. And there were 4 separate attacks at this time. And the good thing about these attacks, and they were not well coordinated, they were separate, they were not escorted by Wildcat fighters. Either they were shot down or they missed their targets. But what it did, it forced the Japanese, as you can see in these pictures, I think I can get a bigger one, excuse me, here. You can see the giant turning radius that a carrier has to execute if it wants to maneuver. You just can't turn on a dime. So what these various attacks from Midway, these air attacks from Midway had, was to discombobulate the Japanese carrier fleet. They were running for their lives, although there were no hits. You see the hits here are missing this particular carrier. But nonetheless, when you're maneuvering, you can't be responding to that air commander's plea that there be another strike on Midway. At this point, after all these attacks on the carriers, the Japanese, you see there at 7:45, finally, there were only 9 of them. So they weren't, usually they would send out before a fleet many, many more, but they only had 7. And because of that, they finally found one at finally found our carriers at 7:45. So what this is going to mean is Nogumo now has a decision to make. We're talking about it. Let's talk about 8 o'clock. So on the one hand, he knows that there are American carriers to his northwest. On the other hand, he has to recover all those aircraft coming from Midway and their bombing runs. And he has to decide, what should I do? Should I launch an air attack against the carriers right now? Or should I wait, recover the Midway planes, and then rearm, because not all of my planes have the torpedoes for their aircraft to attack the carriers. So what should I do? Well, he decided on the more conservative idea to recover his attack group that had bombed Midway, rearm, and go ahead and then go after the US carriers. But what is going to happen now from 9:18 to 10:10, he's going to have several US torpedo attacks against his carriers, which means that they have to continue to maneuver to stay out of the way of being hit. And what we see from this picture, this is Ensign George Gay in the center there with the white around him. Of his squadron off the Yorktown, he was the sole survivor. All those other pilots were lost. But what they did, even though they were lost and they did not in any way hurt the Japanese carriers, they kept them in motion and unable to rearm. So what's going to happen now, by about 10:10, you have these torpedo attacks, unsuccessful, but somewhat astounding the Japanese, because they were amazed at the bravery of our pilots. And many of our pilots were very inexperienced. For many, it was the first actual combat mission that they would serve in. So although the torpedo bombers were all shot down, they kept the Japanese fleet in disarray. And they also brought the Zeros, who were protecting the carriers as well. They brought them to sea level. And because our tactics at that time, our carrier tactics, were not so well defined, we did not simultaneously attack with dive bombers and torpedo planes. So the torpedoes came early. Now come the dive bombers. And from the 5 minutes between 10:22 and 10:27, our 50 dive bombers are able to attack 3 of the Japanese carriers without any Zero interference. It was just such a time of luckiness. And so as I see here, we had scored 4 hits on Kaga. There were 4 3 hits on Soiru, and Akagi had 1 hit, which was enough. And what was happening now is that 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers within 5 minutes had been hit by American dive bombers. It was just spectacular. It was very lucky, but nonetheless, now you would have thought that the Japanese might be, well, they were astounded as well, but there's Hero out there on the right, and it, because of all these maneuverings that had taken place in a couple hours previously, was at a different place and therefore had escaped. But finally, and here's an idea of how a dive bomber might look as he attacked Soiru. And here's a photograph of those 3 carriers burning in the distance with a Wildcat flying in front. It was a tremendous victory. So Hero, the last of the 4 carriers not hit, it was able to launch its aircraft and go after the American carriers, and it did so. Now, what it did so, it's rather interesting because here's where the carriers were located. Ours up in the upper right, the Japanese in the lower left. The Japanese bombers and torpedo planes from Hero hit Yorktown. Now, Yorktown had been hit also way back in May at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the Japanese thought that they had sunk her, but they had good repair doctrine on Yorktown, and so Yorktown was able to hobble away from the Battle of the Coral Sea and become part of the task force that fought the Japan. However, as you can see in this photo, the Japanese bombers and torpedo planes scored 3 hits on Yorktown and sent her into flames. In fact, it looked as though she would be lost to us. But again, her onboard crew was able to patch her up, and she was able to resume operations. Now, in the meantime, Hero was able to launch another attack against the Yorktown and would hit it more, but still it was not going to be successful. And she, in turn, was hit by air bombers and sunk. In fact, on Hero was the admiral in charge of that carrier division, and Admiral Yamaguchi decided to go down with his ship in a very 19th century way of dealing with defeat. So at the end of June 4th, you had all 4 Japanese carriers entirely disabled. And then at early the next morning, Yamamoto, who was about 300 miles back of this attacking fleet and really had played no part in this because his communications were not as good as Admiral Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz was back at Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, and he was able to follow the battle very closely, but Yamamoto was not. And after he found out that his 4 carriers had been sunk, he canceled the Midway operation and left the Midway area. Now, as his fleet turned to the west and the north, 2 of his heavy cruisers, the Mogami and the Makuma, collided. And of course, we found them from our carriers and went after them, and we're going to sink the Makuma and so damage the Mogami, that she had to limp back to Wake Island, and it would be 2 years before she was back in the fleet. So overall, here's what happened at Midway. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, plus a heavy cruiser. We lost Yorktown, who seemed to have 9 lives, and the attending destroyer that was helping her out, but was attacked by those Hiryu fighter planes. So in total, the Japanese lost 250 planes to our 144, and a total of 3,000 men to our 300 men. Now, it's interesting to note that the Japanese air policy was not like ours. In other words, they kept their combat airmen, the fighter pilots, the torpedo pilots, the dive bomber pilots, at sea, rather than rotating them on a regular basis back home, so that they could not only refresh themselves, but also could teach others. And so that's going to be a big problem toward the end of the war, and make necessary the whole concept of the kamikaze. Because if we can't train them, very thoroughly, we can train them to get off, to lift and go after a ship and sacrifice themselves. So Midway is an astounding success for us. Although this is very early in the war, there will be more battles. Some naval battles we will take big hits ourselves, but the Japanese from now on are on the defensive. They no longer will run wild. Their policy will be to fortify the islands they hold, and our policy will be to go after each of those islands. Now, interestingly enough, this is the 2 authors wrote a little book that talked about the defeat of the Japanese Navy at Midway. And I know this is a very complicated slide, and if next time I would make it very much simpler. But anyway, let's quickly go through why the Japanese lost. First of all, they lost because of the intelligence coup by Joe Rochefort. He was able to find out that it was going to happen, and Admiral Nimitz was able to mount an ambush, which was successful. And you saw how complicated it was with not only the carrier attack force, but the support invasion force, the elution force. All these forces are scattered. It would have been much more effective had more of the fleet been closer together. And of course, the dual mission for the carriers, not only to support the Battle of Midway, but to engage the enemy carriers, which means their planes had to have different armament. And to change that armament, you don't just change from a bomb to a torpedo. It takes a good 20 minutes, maybe even a half an hour before you can do that. And that's per plane. Obviously, there was not enough reconnaissance by the Japanese. They were surprised that our carriers were not back at Hawaii, but were actually at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto, who was the brainchild of the plan, became a mere spectator at this battle. His input was minimal, and only at the end. Nogumo, who was in charge of the carriers, he had inadequate search planes trying to find us. Each of his aircraft carriers had a similar disposition. So rather than having, say, 2 aircraft carriers just have nothing but dive bombers ready to go, each carrier carried torpedo planes and dive bombers, and therefore it complicated any rearmament problems. And because of the aircraft dispositions on his carriers, he was unable to launch an immediate attack on the carriers. The Japanese were also mesmerized by the myth of a battleship engagement. They continue to hope that at some point their battleship fleet would encounter our battleship fleet and they would be the victors. That never happened. I've talked about the Navy air policies where the combat pilots were kept at sea and there were no large reserve programs. Interestingly enough, at Midway, our ships had radar. The Japanese ships did not have radar, although a Japanese inventor in the 20s was one of the early innovators with radar, and it was just not adopted by the Japanese fleet. Also, there was this element of arrogance. The Japanese, for those first 6 months in the Pacific, had encountered virtually no real opposition, and at Midway they did. And the root cause, these two authors said, was a traditional Japanese national character. I'm sure we could have a whole discussion about that with the worship of the emperor, a very militarized society, just very interesting. But you can see there was a lot of things that the Japanese Navy fell prey to, and this was all revealed at Midway. Now, just briefly, what if we had been defeated? What if the U.S. had been defeated at Midway? I think it would be a mixed blessing for the Japanese, because Midway is about 2,000 miles away. For them to constantly have to resupply that with our planes just 1,300 miles away at Hawaii and our submarines in the vicinity, it was going to be a difficult task at best. And of course, the Aleutian Islands, yes, they were able to land some troops up there, but the weather is so bad up there on a regular basis that it was not a benefit to them at all. I think the biggest thing that might have been affected would be the Allied Europe First strategy would have been delayed, because if we had the Japanese much closer to our doorstep at Midway, we would have wanted to throw much more of our military might against Japan rather than having to share it with our allies in Europe. And then finally, the sources. There is so much, and incredible. The more I looked at the internet, the more I came upon interesting stories of Midway. I would particularly recommend Craig Simon's, the third one down. His Battle of Midway was the text I used mostly. And also he has a YouTube group, a video called The Battle of Midway. And you can go through and I could have almost shown that instead of talking about it, but you need a little bit of a background because it tends to be a rather complicated battle. So that's pretty much the story of Midway. I'm just going back to my original cover page. It looked like we were going to be able to, here we go. Midway was so an important strategic battle in the sense that it did turn the whole focus of the Japanese fleet from offense to defense. And from there, as our might, and we started to use our industrial might to build ships and armament and train men, it was literally only a matter of time before we overwhelmed the Japanese. And that's it. So Linda, if you will take over, I'll be happy to entertain any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Grace. We already have some questions posted. Reminder, folks, if you have a question, if you wish to type your question, just click on the Q&A bar and type your question. If you would like to speak, maybe make a comment or anything, click on the raise hand icon. And if you do that, we will recognize you. And I see we already have several items in the chat bar. Okay, so to start with, Ken Brown, who is also quite interested in naval history, looked at your bibliography and wonders, did you ever read the book Shattered Sword?
I know about it. No, I have not read it, but it's my next to do.
Okay, if Ken wants to comment on it, by all means, Ken,
Right.
you can raise your hand and
I can I can allow him to talk. So
yeah.
Kenneth, you should be good to unmute yourself and talk.
If you want to tell us about Shattered Sword, go ahead.
Yeah, great.
Oops, sorry. Go ahead. Do it again. I clicked the wrong thing.
Go ahead, Kate.
Gresh, Shattered Sword is, I forget the authors, but if you Google Shattered Sword, you'll find it. It's available from Amazon if you're interested. It's quite an exhaustive book on the really on Japanese naval history and what they did right and what they did wrong, mostly wrong as far as the Battle of Midway. But it's quite it's a little bit different because it's taken from a lot of Japanese sources, and
Okay.
there was a lot of the other Japanese sources that were published in English were very much fraught with internal Japanese political issues that were going on at the time. Who's to blame and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
So, but I think when you read this, you'll find it quite interesting. And when you go through, you mentioned some of the mistakes that Japanese made. This book goes through it in much detail.
Okay, good. Yeah, here's the, if you can see this, Battle of Midway. This is a paperback by Craig Simons. And Simons has been a professor at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. So he has an impeccably orchestrated YouTube video available.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Arthur's iPad. Is that our friend Art Daltus? I think he has his hand up. So if you can now talk, go ahead, Art.
And unmute yourself perhaps too.
Talking permitted, so.
Okay, got me?
Yep, go ahead.
There you go.
Okay, no, I'm Art Sotak, your nemesis.
Of course, hon. I'm sorry. Hon. Yes, of course.
Listen, my brother was walking the deck of the USS Maryland battleship on December 7th when the Japanese attacked.
Wow.
And fortunately, he was on the inside of where they moored the ships, because the ones on the outside, like West Virginia and others, they were the next to go to sea. So he had been at sea, and they put the last at sea up against the dock, and they couldn't even use their weapons because they couldn't, maneuver them. They'd be shooting at buildings.
Yeah.
Anyway, he mentioned that he'd been in a lot of battles in the South Pacific, a zillion kamikaze attacks, had been reported sunk many times by the Japanese. But you didn't mention any battleship, and I know they had a lot of damage at Pearl Harbor, but they had to go back to Bremerton, Washington for repairs and refitting. So I don't know if they got back to the Pacific for the Battle of Midway. Were there battleships involved in the Battle of Midway?
Not from our side.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yamamoto, though, was on the Yamato, which was the biggest warship, I guess, biggest battleship ever built. But he was so far away from what was going on that he just didn't play a big role in the whole situation.
Yeah, my brother passed away 4 years ago. Didn't make it to 100.
Yeah. Good for him, though.
That's a great story. Thank you, Art. Appreciate that. Also, with his hand raised is Roger Kingston. Can we give him permission to talk? Go ahead, Roger.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, I'm Roger Kingston. A little before you were serving on the Coral Sea off of Vietnam, I was serving on the USS Hornet out of Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
And Long Beach. I was in the Marine Detachment. I was one of the jarheads.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm a big fan of World War II history, and particularly the Battle of Midway. And I think you did a great job.
Thank you.
I have two comments. So one, I think you switched. I think Spruance was in charge of the Enterprise and the Hornet, and Fletcher was in charge of the Yorktown, if I'm not mistaken, and the other two altogether. But,
yeah, I looked at that, Roger, and now I'm confused myself because it was my understanding that that Fletcher was on Yorktown.
He came later when the Yorktown arrived.
Yeah, and although I've seen some other references anyway, because he then yielded tactical command to Spruance.
Yeah,
and then
Spruance, more about Spruance. Spruance, I think, was the great admiral of World War II, just for that battle alone. But he did some other things that were really great, and he was castigated badly for not chasing after Yamamoto, when the wisest thing he could have done was to stay around Midway and follow the orders to protect Midway. But
right, precisely
that he did turn the war around in those 5 minutes that you spoke so well about.
Yeah. Well, now, right after this whole engagement, Spruance was brought on by Nimitz to be his number two.
Mm-hmm.
And so together they kind of orchestrated the Pacific campaign, and then Spruance and Halsey, would then alternate between one fleet and another as they island hopped.
And they changed names with the fleets as they alternated.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, and it was very wise because, it's easy for us to talk in all these years ago, but if you were actually on the flight decks during these battles, the strain on these guys making the decision was enormous.
Right.
And in fact, Halsey, coming back with Yorktown from the Coral Sea battle, had psoriasis so bad that that's why he didn't take part in the Midway campaign at all. He was in the hospital.
Thank God for his psoriasis, because he would have gone chasing after Yamamoto.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll you can mute me again now. I don't know how you do that.
Okay, thank you,
Roger. Now, Gresh, just to show you that we have a really interested audience and they're very good on details, two different people have commented on, you talked about B-25s being launched in the Doolittle Raid, and you also mentioned from the Hornet. A veteran from our friends at the Bedford VA is wondering if you really meant B-17.
I did indeed.
And Judy and Mike Alexander. I'm sorry, wait a minute. You said B-17.
Yes, yes.
B-17.
That was B-25 should have been the answer. Should have been B-25.
Said, are you sure it wasn't a B-25? And Judy and Mike Alexander said, I believe it was a B-25.
Oh, whoops.
So I offer two comments that maybe the B-17 was a B-25.
Yes,
And
I yield.
I thank our audience for being such good listeners. So that'd be just something to follow up on.
Sure.
Okay, Larry, no last name, asks, is it not the case that the Imperial Japanese Navy also had a major fuel problem around that time? There was high sulfur content in the oil that came from the Dutch East Indies.
Oh, wow. That's too sophisticated for me to comment on. I don't know. I know our oil embargo of the Japanese fleet prior to Pearl Harbor was a factor in their needing a way to find adequate fuel, and that's why, to some extent, you might say we pushed them into World War II by denying their fleet adequate oil. But as far as the difficulty with the oil there, maybe Shattered Sword, that other book that has been referenced, would talk about that.
Okay. Larry also asks, did not Midway send its broken water system on Clare? What does that mean? Open air? Oh,
Yes, yes.
so that the Navy would get the message. I don't think that we knew that they had broken our code. That perhaps the message was sent out in the open air.
Oh, I see. I see the distinction.
It wasn't coded.
Yeah,
You know what we could do? We could, since Larry has asked two excellent questions, if you want to unmute yourself, Larry. Oh my goodness, here he is again. You stated that assuming the taking of Midway, anyway, he's got some information, some opinions about Midway being the staging area for an invasion. Larry, if you want to make some personal comments, let's unmute you.
sure.
And you can group all three of your comments into one and say a few words. Go ahead, Larry. You're on.
You have to unmute.
I believe you are. I believe we have unmuted you. That's what
Oh, maybe
Matt
he
has done
left.
that. Yep.
Yeah.
So at your convenience, Larry, go ahead. Maybe he doesn't want to. We'll give him another 10 seconds.
There's two Larrys. I'll just allow both to talk just in case if one is like.
Yeah, I don't know who this one is. It's Jeff. I see what you mean. We have two Larrys. This one has an uppercase L.
Yeah, that's the one I initially unmuted. So I unmuted the lowercase one just in
Okay.
case it was a duplicate.
Okay, we'll move on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me go back to Jim's question. Jim Ramsey wanted to know, he was curious about the three U.S. carriers. What was their home port?
They would have been at Pearl Harbor. And that's why the Japanese had hoped to get them at the Battle of Pearl Harbor in December, but they were all out on maneuvers. And so then I think after Pearl Harbor, they were shifted from, or rather to Hawaii, where they were home ported there. Because Hawaii then became it was our major Pacific headquarters. And that's where Nimitz stayed throughout the whole war.
Okay. You notice the detail of the questions you're getting. So Ed LaTurco wants to know what happened to the planes connected to the Yorktown after the Yorktown went down. Did they go to Midway? Did they go to other carriers? Do you have any?
Right. The answer is both. Some Some found their way to Midway Island, and others went to the other two carriers, Enterprise and Hornet.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's your answer, Ed. Let me see. Did I see Ed's name here? So another book recommendation, since I know you're a great reader, and for everybody else, David Horton. Excellent presentation of such a significant World War II event. May I recommend a book titled Sea of Thunder?
Sea of Thunder. Okay.
By Evan Thomas, subtitled The Last Great Naval Campaign of World War II.
Okay. Thank you.
Told from the perspective of both the American and the Japanese naval commanders, as well as ordinary seamen, an excellent read of the horrors of war and the mentalities of the commanders.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Okay.
There's just endless material, not just on Midway, but on any battle you can think of. Just Google it.
Right. Yeah, Bill Gerber has a comment about the B-25s. They were definitely B-25s. The B-17s were too big.
Okay.
So, okay.
I'm just a poor Navy guy here, you know.
Ken Brown says B-17s at Midway, B-25s at Doolittle's Raid.
Okay.
Okay. I tell you, we got some really good experts here. Okay. And another veteran from the Bedford VA definitely thinks that the message that was sent to deceive the Japanese about the water was definitely sent in the open air.
Oh, open air. Okay.
It was not coded. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Bill Gerber asks, were the U.S. carriers not out delivering planes to Midway and perhaps other points?
Well, as soon as we found out that this sneak attack by the Japanese was going to come about, yeah, Nimitz started to fortify the Midway Islands, the two little islands there. And surely that's the easiest way to take, if a plane can't fly from Hawaii to Midway, he has to be transported. So I guess they went both ways. But we threw everything that was available in the Pacific to Midway to await the Japanese attack.
Okay. Ed Loturco has something very interesting to say. I think we should unmute Ed Loturco. My uncle flew off the Yorktown in Wildcats. I think we ought to have Ed say a little bit more about that, shouldn't we? Ed?
You can unmute yourself.
You can unmute yourself. Would you want to expound on that a bit?
Sure. We had, unfortunately, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, my Uncle Frank, also same last name, flew Wildcats off to Yorktown. And all of this history, his log books of all the sorties, everything right on through the Korean War, were all burnt in a home fire. They had an actual museum for him by his son, my cousin, and that unfortunately went up in flames. He was also the pilot that went down at LaGuardia Airfield in the chopper that crashed in Pan Am building back in 1962. So we lost him then. But he used to tell us all these stories about the Wildcats. Not only that, but the other one with the two-seater, how there was a cameraman in the backseat when he used to fly bombing raids over Korea. But he was a real Yorktown guy, the way he used to talk about it. So he's one person I really miss because there was a lot of history that this day I would have been asking him an awful lot of questions. And he also, and there's a follow-up to this with John Ryan. If you remember, he spoke to all of us on the B-25s in Doolittle. John's now passed on,
Yes,
but he was one of our speakers.
Yep, he was.
Oh, good heavens. Yeah.
Yes.
That's all I
Yeah,
got.
Yeah. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Ed. Marianne de Blasi just has a comment. If anyone has the chance to visit the Midway Airport in Chicago, there is an impressive memorial tribute at Concourse A. It includes one of the fighter planes hung from the ceiling.
Huh.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. I could make a quick comment that the picture I showed you of the Zero is
Yes.
taken from an existing, as we speak now, Museum of the Pacific War in beautiful downtown Tokyo. And they call it the Great Pacific War. And as you walk around, there's this haunting music in the background, and they emphasize the loss of the pilots and the people connection rather than the what we would judge to be the aggressive nature of the Japanese Navy at that point.
Okay. I'm double checking here. We're all set for the Q&A. Did Larry ever show up? Larry? Going, gone. You still have a chance to say something if you want to. And I'm checking the raised hands. I think we've got all the raised hands. We've got all the Q&As. Let's just double check chat. Okay, I think I've got everybody who asked a question. So last call for questions or comments. Are there any final questions for Gresh? Oh, I'm
I got a
sorry.
Bill Gerber question or comment there
Yeah? Did I not ask it?
in the chat.
Yeah?
On the chat, it says, and it's not complete because it says that being the reason the Japanese did not catch the carriers during the Pearl Harbor attack.
I saw that.
Not clear.
And
Oh,
because
not
it
clear
was an
what that.
incomplete sentence, I skipped
Was
it.
it? I think it was related to the where the U.S. carrier is not out delivering planes to Midway and perhaps other points.
Oh,
Not at that point. They were just out on maneuvers from Pearl Harbor.
well, didn't you say, Gresh, the carriers deliberately planned an ambush? They were lying in wait for the Japanese. They weren't just running around.
Oh, absolutely. Yes,
This
indeed.
was a
Yeah.
planned ambush attack.
Yes, indeed it was. Yeah. But they were stationed at Pearl Harbor.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
If
Midway.
that's not clear, Bill Gerber, if you want to clarify your question or your statement, go ahead, you can speak.
Oh, sorry, just gotta allow him.
Matt, you're terrific. Thank you. You're very fast.
Bill, you should be able to unmute yourself
Okay.
if you want.
It was my understanding that the reason that the carriers were absent from Pearl Harbor at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, that they had been out delivering aircraft to some of the outlying defense points, including Midway,
Oh,
and were on their way back at about the time that the attack took place. And so they weren't there to be caught.
Right.
Oh,
Another
thank you.
lucky turn.
yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I misunderstood that. Thank you for
Yeah,
clarifying.
it was a fragmented question, so
Thank you.
my problem.
And a final thank you. The veterans at the Bedford VA have signed off. The veterans at the Bedford VA want to thank all of you for having us. They enjoyed the presentation and thought you did an excellent job! Exclamation point. So
Thank you.
thought
Thank you.
you'd like to know that, Gresh?
Yes.
They were very active. They asked quite a few questions. You can tell they listened carefully because
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
yes. And Captain Al Landry, who is U.S. Coast Guard retired, just wanted you to know, excellent presentation, Captain. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We certainly want to pass on the kudos when they come. That's right. Yeah.
It was
All
one
right.
last one that came in. One last comment.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We have one more. Let's make this our final question. Judy and Mike Alexander, re the Japanese Museum, emphasizing the loss of life rather than aggression. This is consistent with Japan's post-World War II turn to pacifism.
Okay. Yeah. But I tell you, when you walked in there, and it's the same for the museum down at Hiroshima. They have this background music that, and of course, the terrible pictures of the bomb's destruction of people and everything else. But yeah, it's as if it's not even part of a war, that it just, we dropped the bomb and here's what happened, and with no explanation about why we might have done so.
Okay, I think we're done. Well, that was a very lively and interactive Q&A and chat session. Thank you to everybody who contributed. We really appreciate it, particularly those who have personal experience, who had relatives or family members. Thank you for contributing. You really enriched our conversation this afternoon. Thank you to Gresh. It took him many weeks, if not months, to do the research and to prepare for this talk. And I think the results, and weren't you going to tell us who helped you prepare for this?
Oh my gosh, yes. My grandson, Evan Lattimore in New Jersey. He and I have been Zooming back and forth to put the slides together. And so he may be the next Lexington Veterans Association webmaster.
It just goes to show those 16-year-olds or whatever they are can run circles around us. Well,
Absolutely.
you tell him he did a wonderful job. The visuals were terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you all, folks, for joining us. It was wonderful to see you. Remember, next month, it's Tuesday, October 12th. We look forward to seeing you again. And in the meantime, thank you and good afternoon.